welcome and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut for today's discussion, Stop Motion, Global Migration, Rhetoric and Reality, with special guest Kathleen Newland, Senior Fellow and Co-Founder of the Migration Policy Institute. Kathleen, thank you for being with us today.
It's such a pleasure.
And my name is Amanda Jolly, VP of Programs with the Council, and I'll also be moderating today's discussion. So in December 2019, the world had a record 275 million migrants. Then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Today, with over 170 countries restricting travel or instituting national lockdowns, global migration has all but been brought to zero. At the same time, the US administration last week announced new rules restricting immigration to the US. What does this mean for US leadership, global development, human health and security, and global economic growth? We're thrilled to be joined today by Kathleen Newland to discuss these questions. And Kathleen Newland, by way of brief introduction, her very extensive expertise and career, she is a senior fellow and co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute. Her work focuses on the governance of international migration, the relationship between migration and development, and refugee protection. Prior, Kathleen co-directed the International Migration Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment. She also held positions at such institutions from the London School of Economics, the International Organization for Migration, the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, UNICEF, the World Bank, and more. Kathleen, again, we're so glad you can join us today and share your expertise with us.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
And now let's just dive into the conversation. Excellent. And Kathleen, so essential to migration is the ability to move itself. So can you set the stage for us? How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the and the international response to that pandemic affected the variability of people to move around the world today?
Well, it basically brought it to a screaming halt from in February and then particularly in March. Almost every country in the world instituted border restrictions, restrictions on flights, and this is only now beginning to unfreeze very gradually and selectively based on relative levels of infection and to some extent on pre-existing ties. While some travel is beginning to resume, migration, that is involving longer term stays, is still pretty much paralyzed. Different countries are starting to sort out their precautions, their procedures, their needs, and their fears. So we see some countries that are admitting essential workers, and of course every country pretty much defines that differently. Healthcare workers are usually on the list. For a number of countries, seasonal agricultural workers are on the list because so many of the European and indeed North American countries are dependent on migrants to come in during the harvest season and pick the fruits, the vegetables, and later more commodity crops, as well as processing those crops and also livestock for the food chain.
Thank you. And thank you for setting the stage for us, because in the midst of this, we've all seen last week's order by the Trump administration, which will reduce the number of temporary workers and family members permitted to enter the US. Can you describe this order for us and what effect these restrictions will have on the US?
Sure. It's very complex because there are a lot of moving parts in these proclamations from the president. The first major one on April 22nd put in place a suspension of green cards, that is permanent migration, which is to last until, was to last until June 22nd, 23rd, but now has been extended to the end of the year. That set of restrictions is in a way more performative than real, because there are so many exceptions, and that is true to a lesser extent, but still to some extent, of the June 22nd proclamation, which you referred to, which extends the restrictions on family migration, but also suspends several categories of temporary workers. And there are lots of exceptions there as well, and I'll go into that a little bit without getting too long. But the exceptions, well, let me start with the categories that are affected by these restrictions. One is in the permanent employment-based, there is a whole set of visas for people of outstanding talent. That's, researchers, scientists, artists, athletes even, executives, people with advanced degrees, and then some special categories like religious workers, nuns and priests and so on, translators. There is now in the temporary category a suspension of the visa called the H-1B, which is probably familiar to many of you, which goes to workers with highly specialized knowledge in a specialty occupation. Many of them are well over half go to tech workers. And it's the classic is sort of the Indian software engineer who's coming to work in one of the big US tech companies. But also suspended are the H-2B category, which applies to non-agricultural seasonal workers. And these are people like landscapers, seafood workers, people in construction, hospitality, food service, and so on, who come in basically during the harvest and or holiday season. Not the harvest, but the summer season when a lot of outdoor work is being done. There's also a suspension of J visas for interns, au pairs. I know that has a lot of families in a panic for what they're going to do about childcare. Also, the J visas are for people like camp counselors and trainees. And then the permanent family-based restrictions, which are really going to affect a lot of permanent residents of this country, are halting entry of the not just permanent residents, but also citizens in some cases. For example, the parents of citizens are restricted for the duration of this proclamation, as are the unmarried adult children of citizens and the adult siblings of US citizens. Spouses and unmarried adult children of legal permanent residents are restricted, and a few other categories. So this is a huge blow to family immigration, which accounts for somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of all US immigration, and will affect a lot of people who have been longing to have their relatives join them. It's interesting to look at the exceptions to these restrictions. I mentioned healthcare professionals who are working on COVID-19 related work are accepted from restrictions. Minor children of both citizens and legal permanent residents. Interestingly, the investor category, the EB-5 visa, is still allowed to enter. I think you have to invest now $900,000 in an enterprise that's expected to create jobs in the US. And importantly, the H-2A visa for temporary agricultural workers is accepted. People can still come in to work on the harvest, and students are still allowed to come in. A lot of people expected that students would be restricted, but they haven't. And then there's a broad category of national interest entries, which nobody really knows exactly what that applies to. How many people are affected? It's kind of hard to say. We have about 550,000 each year in those permanent visa categories that have been restricted, but in the what are called sort of confusingly the non-immigrant categories, which basically means temporary immigrants, the restrictions don't apply to those who are already in the country. So if you have an H-1B worker who's applying for an extension or a student who's applying for a training period, those are not affected. So it's a little hard to know exactly how many people are involved here. Sorry for that long-winded answer, but it's a complicated set of restrictions. And I might just add that it's very much of a piece with the restrictions that the Trump administration has been pursuing throughout its tenure. And they just couldn't find a way to restrict particularly these relatives of citizens and other categories considered essential for businesses. But COVID-19 provides the perfect cover for those measures that they had been hoping to take, particularly to restrict legal immigration.
That was a fantastic breakdown, and thank you for going through that. That was a question we were going to get into later, but that was a perfect segue. Can you, as we look at some of these new immigration policies, both in the U.S. and then that are happening globally, either restrictive or exceptions, are there some that you think are just short term and that will revert? And then are there others that you think might stick around for a while? And if so, in this case in particular, do you think this is one that, as you mentioned, might be one that there's political will to stick around for? Or do you think this is something that is just applicable to COVID and then will be lifted?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And the US is as far as I know, still unique among countries in that it is justifying these restrictions on immigration explicitly on the grounds of the labor market, whereas every other country is restricting them on the grounds of public health. Now, the US is using public health justifications as well, but in the most recent proclamation, and actually I believe in the April 22nd one also, it was justified on the grounds of not creating competition for US workers at a time of high unemployment. That to me implies that there may well be an effort to make these longer term, despite the fact that there is a great deal of resistance, both from businesses and from families, whether they're worried about relatives who've been planning to join them, or worried about where they're going to get childcare or elder care or so on.
Thank you.
With other countries, I think the restrictions are very much tied to the pandemic. Now, there may be some sliding around there, but so far at least they're saying it's public health.
And so as we look around the world, and with your broad background of expertise in seeing migration policy and what works, what doesn't work around the world, can you give us a little bit of a background or some maybe some policy recommendations here, and how can countries balance this essential conflict between, or maybe it's not a conflict, between managing public health risks and effective policy towards migration and asylum seekers?
That's a great question. Thank you, Amanda. It's entirely possible to reconcile the need for migration and the desire on the part of many residents of many countries for migration, to reconcile that with public health measures. And we have some examples in smaller immigration programs of how that can work. For example, the refugee resettlement program, although it's been drastically reduced in the case of the US in the last, during this administration. Refugee resettlement has long been a program that involves heavy duty health screening before people move. And it adds a layer of complexity to the migration process, but it certainly can be done. And I think that is one of the things that is going to help countries reconcile their need for migrants with public health concerns. Testing people on arrival is already starting to some extent, although mainly applying to sort of not specifically for migrants, but just for travelers. I know in Frankfurt Airport and Vienna Airport, you can pay for and get a COVID-19 test on arrival, which exempts you from having to quarantine. And I think we'll be seeing, much more of that kind of thing if countries are serious about inhibiting the spread of the virus while reopening migration. And there's no question that there's just study after study after study that shows that migrants help to create jobs for the most part, although there's some competition for less well-trained natives. Generally speaking, more migration is associated with more jobs, not fewer.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to bring in an audience question now. And to everyone out there on Facebook or in Zoom, feel free to keep submitting those questions. We have some really good ones here. One that just came in asks, after the lockdowns and travel restrictions are lifted as policies, as they cascade around the world, do you expect a surge in global migration? And if so, do you think that the existing systems are ready for this surge, are prepared to meet it?
I think it's going to vary a great deal by country. And, we've in the same way that we've seen that some countries have dealt with suppressing the spread of the virus better than others, I think that we will see certain countries dealing with the resumption of travel and indeed the resumption of migration, which of course are two different things. And I think that, some countries are already restarting tourism. For example, Spain, even though the European Union has not come to a common position on travel from the United Kingdom, Spain has said they want British tourists to come this summer because their tourism industry is very dependent on British tourists. So I think one of the real struggles going forward is going to be how to achieve some consistency in these in the measures that are taken by different states. You have the idea of travel bubbles arising, where certain countries feel very comfortable having each other's citizens visit. There's one in the Baltic states, for example. Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia have formed a travel bubble where there are no restrictions among those three countries. Australia and New Zealand are talking about doing the same. And I wouldn't be surprised if they included some of the small Pacific island states like Vanuatu and Kiribati, which so far I think are among the very few countries in the world that don't have any COVID-19 cases reported, small island states with restricted travel. So it's going to be, even the European Union is really struggling with getting all its members to agree on what the conditions for travel and migration are going to be. And if there isn't some consistency, it's going to be harder to suppress the spread of the virus. If your neighbor is not restricting entry or not testing people as they arrive or not imposing conditions at work that reinforce social distancing and so on, if they aren't doing it and you are, those porous borders are going to create problems for everyone. I hope that answers your question.
Well said, of course. And one thing we really want to talk about, especially because we have you with your background, is the question of developing countries and how the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically in tandem with migration policy and restrictions, are affecting developing countries and the trajectory of global development itself.
Well, that's really important, and I think because we're all somewhat preoccupied with our own immediate situation, it's a question that's getting less attention than I think it needs, because the impact on developing countries really threatens to wipe out decades of progress in reducing poverty. The connection between rich countries and poor countries very often is through migration. And there are sort of estimated to be 164 million international migrants who are in the labor force. A lot of them are doing the jobs that native-born workers don't want to do. And the connection really is through the remittances that migrants send back. The World Bank is currently estimating that remittances will drop by about 20% in 2020. That's over $100 billion, because to low and middle income countries, the last year remittances were over 550 billion. This year, they're expected to be lower than 440 billion. And that just has a huge impact on migrant households, some of which have remittances their only income, many of which have remittances as more than half of their incomes. And also on the countries of origin, because these remittances are the biggest flow of foreign exchange that they have, and it allows them to, pay for imports and balance their balance of payments. So it's a really dire prospect if this kind of decline goes on for a long time. The World Bank is predicting that 40 to 60 million people may be pushed back into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic, and a lot of that transmission of the economic pain comes through migration and the cutting off of remittance streams. There are over 30 countries in the world that rely on remittances for more than 10% of their gross domestic product. So this is a huge blow for countries that are already struggling, who were already struggling before the pandemic.
Thank you. And that, if we can pull in another audience question, ties in directly to a question we just received, which you touched on, but I was wondering if you can expand on the idea of global inequality increasing as a metric. So the question that was submitted is, with limited migration, halting labor movement and remittances, what impact will this have on global economic inequality overall? So is that something we're seeing, or we expect to see increasing that gap?
Yes, and I think it will have an impact, and it's the impact of migration on inequality is controversial. I think you have to separate it into looking at inequality within countries as opposed to inequality among countries. And migration almost surely reduces inequality among countries. It may, in the short term, increase inequality within countries because the households that are earning remittances tend to progress faster than those that aren't. But of course, now that pattern has been disrupted and even in some cases reversed. I've just seen a study from Bangladesh that shows that the households with a migrant that were in higher levels of the income distribution are now at the bottom. They've lost income. They don't have alternatives domestically. So we can talk about BC, before COVID and after COVID, but I think before COVID, the migration was likely in the short term to increase inequality at a very local level, but in the longer term, reduce it as it contributes to national development. There's some controversy also about the impact on inequality among countries. There are those who see migration as just another way that rich countries suck all the most productive assets into their own economies, the best and the brightest. But then there are also those who see these big transfers of income, and not only transfers of income to countries of migrant origin, but also the kind of sort of social and intellectual remittances that come with a big diaspora population investing their talents and energies and expertise back in their home countries.
Thank you, thank you. And so, as I know we have limited time remaining, we're talking about global inequality, labor migration, remittances. Could you sum up some of the major trends that you're observing in migration as a result of the COVID pandemic, and which trends you think might be here to stay as we move forward, these big global forces?
We're really in the realm of both known unknowns and unknown unknowns, as former Defense Secretary Rumsfeld put it. And I think it's very hard to see what the picture will look like. Some people think we're at the end of the age of migration, that migration is going to be a much smaller global phenomenon than it has been in the last couple of decades. Even those who predict that we're at the beginning of the end of the age of globalization as we have known it. But I think that the gains from migration, both for the sending countries and even more for the countries that are receiving migrants, are so great, and industries have become so dependent on the global flows of talent to remain competitive, that there is going to be tremendous pressure to find ways of resuming the flows of migration. But there are countervailing forces too. You know, many of those software engineers may be able to work remotely from their homes in the Philippines or India or Ethiopia or wherever they may be. And that may keep some of the income flowing, but reduce the flows of actual persons. It's hard to see the tourism industry surviving not only without tourists, but without migrant workers, because so much of the labor in the industry is performed by migrants. So many uncertainties. It's really hard to predict with any confidence where we will go from here. I think the one thing that we can be sure of is that things will be different. We just don't know different in what ways.
Thank you. Well said. Well said. Thank you so much. And Kathleen, I hope you know that we have dozens of more audience questions that are fantastic. We know we want to talk about containment, national containment, international relations, U.S. leadership. So I hope we might be able to invite you back to talk about this again. We'd love to have you, and maybe up in Connecticut next time when we're able to.
I would be very happy to be with you in person, but we'll join remotely if that's the only way.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Kathleen. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your analysis, and thank you everyone who's joining us today on Zoom, on Facebook. I want to invite everyone, if you are able to join us next week, next Wednesday, again from noon to 12:30, we will be addressing the cybersecurity threats posed to the 2020 elections with Arthur House, who is the cybersecurity policy advisor to Connecticut's Secretary of the State. So that should be another great discussion. I hope you can join us there. You can find out more on our website, ctwac.org. And as always, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at World Affairs Council of Connecticut. You can revisit today's conversation, and you can check out all of the prior episodes as well. I want to say a huge thank you again for joining us. And Kathleen, thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe and well out there.
Thank you very much. Bye.